Just one hand per person. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15, 16, 17, 18, 19. This is a small scale quantitative study. 19. Did I say 19? Yeah. Okay. Who thinks that outcomes are a trap? Okay. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12. And whose arms are too tired to be lifting up at this time in the morning? Nobody. Good. So this is exciting. We've got 19 for, 13 against. I am going to conduct a recount at the end of the kind of formal bit, just to see if there's any changes. So 19 for, 13 against, everything to play for. Mostly what I'm going to do is talk about this report, which I wrote, and done that. So just to, there's the cover, it's a bit bigger. There are two phrases on the report that I want to highlight immediately. One is that it is a review of the wider impact of play initiatives. Okay, really important. Two things to emphasise. Firstly, we are talking about play initiatives here. In a slightly more technical jargon, we're talking about interventions, things that can be done, can be paid for through public money. We're not talking about play, the process. We're talking about play interventions, things that, in particular, politicians, decision makers, people with their hands on the budgets, might choose to spend money on. And we're talking about their wider impact. In other words, not things that are happening for children or for other people in the immediate here and now, but longer term. The difference that these interventions might make over time. So that's two really important kind of starting points for this piece of work. And one of the my notes. And the reason I'm emphasising this is that, to my knowledge, this is the first time that this kind of review has been carried out within the play sector. The play sector has had loads of reviews and reports and on why play matters and the benefits of play, and going back to best play, which some of you in this room will remember, right through I've got about half a dozen reports that I think I reference in here. But none have taken this actually quite hard-nosed quantitative focus. So that's my running order. I'm going to say a bit more about the background to the report and my approach. I'm going to share the findings. I'm going to sort of address that question which you often hear, I think, around play. Well, it's obvious. Is this obvious that playing is good for kids? And I'll unpick that. I'll share some limitations and criticisms of this approach, and close with repeating and revisiting that question that I asked at the start.
You know, when you ask us to ask you questions as you're going on,
yes.
When you use the phrase "it's good for," can you say a bit more about that and maybe contest it as well?
Can I say a bit more? Okay. In terms of this report, I'll come on to say what we define the outcomes, the kind of outcomes that you're interested in. But I guess it elaborates that point I just made, that this report was not looking at, for instance, sort of measures of children's intrinsic enjoyment or subjective well-being at that time. It was looking at the kind of, I suppose, in simple terms, it was looking at the kind of outcomes that, in particular, the current political discourse, current politicians are interested in, measurable longer-term outcomes. And I'll come on to say a bit more about that. Now, the kind of way in which that's contested is one of the things that I'll come back to near the end when I kind of explore limitations and criticisms. So if it's okay, and I'm sure there'll be others in the room who will have views on that as well. So is it okay to park that debate? Good. I won't always do that, but on this occasion I think it's legitimate. Okay. So, but first, I'm going to give you some figures about type 2 diabetes. And people say, oh no, he's going to talk about physical activity again. Yes, I am going to talk about physical activity, but I think it actually is, one of the things that I'm interested in here is as it were, seeing play through the eyes of people who are not already sold on the idea of play. Okay? If you're already sold on the idea of play, in a way none of this is going to be of any interest to you. So let's look at the world through the eyes of people who are not sold on the idea of play. And type 2 diabetes is a pretty good place to start. I don't know if you can all read this figure. Treatment of type 2 diabetes costs 10% of the total NHS budget. I just want to pause for a minute to let you digest the significance of that statistic. Okay, we would be able to spend 10% more, not 1 or 2%, which is what politicians are arguing about at the moment, but 10% more on treating medical conditions of all kinds if we didn't have if we have no levels of type 2 diabetes. Well, you can jiggle the figures around. Now that, I didn't know that figure before I did this little piece of research. I don't know about you, I think that is breathtaking. A single, basically lifestyle-related, treatable condition is generating 10% of the total cost of the National Health Service. What's more, exercise cuts the risk of type 2 diabetes. Well, the Pope is a Catholic and all that, but actually, not only can I claim that, but I can source that claim. Okay, there is clear, kosher, robust evidence that makes that link. You can see where I'm going here. And active children grow up to be active adults. Again, you might think that was obvious, but there is some good longitudinal studies that show that. So you've got a nice, pretty short straight line path between being active as a child and a reduction in type 2 diabetes. It's not, I haven't unpacked it for you, and there's lots of uncertainties about how much that 10% figure might go down, blah blah blah, but it's a nice short line of the type that public health officials and politicians are very interested in. Moreover, so this is again a slightly scrappy graph, but this graph shows you how much type 2 diabetes has been, the prevalence of type 2 diabetes has been growing. So just in a less than 10-year period, it's doubled. Okay, so when we talk about it being a preventable lifestyle illness, I mean that's, we hear a lot about the obesity epidemic, don't we? Oh, it's another epidemic. I keep on thinking it's all doom and gloom, but that, by any measure, that is an extraordinary shift in, or it's an extraordinary public health change. So, I think it's useful for play people to have this knowledge. You may decide not to use it, but at least to know that it's there. Okay, so the catalyst to this report, Play Return, was a meeting about a year and a bit ago. Were you there, Leslie? November. Yeah, November, between the Children's Play Policy Forum, which for those of you who don't know it is a kind of, it's a 4 nations and cross-sector group of organisations that have an interest in play. So the 4 play nations, Playing England, Scotland, Wales and Playboard Northern Ireland are on it. The Government Association, Skills Active, Association of Play Industry, so the manufacturers, basically kind of more or less anyone at the national level with an interest in play is on this group. And the Play Policy Forum secured a meeting with Nick Hurd, who at the time was Minister for Civil Society. Crucially, his department had funded the Free Time Consortium programme that Play England ran, which was about kind of promoting volunteering and community action in community play settings. So his department had an interest in play, and on the back of that, CPPS secured a meeting with Nick Hurd. And the one thing that we wanted to get out of that meeting with Nick Hurd was that he would basically kind of take play on and when I say play, I mean the topic of children's play as a kind of I think he talked about it being a kind of topic of interest or topic of special interest for his department, the Cabinet Office. And the reason we were so keen to see this happen is because, as any of you who know who follow government interest in play will know for the past 5 years the government has had practically zero interest in play, and in particular the previous interest from what was Department for Children, Schools and Families vanished into the air. So really there was no ministerial or really departmental interest in children's play. So you can see that things were, that it felt like an opportunity. And off the back of that, the one question that we asked Nick Hurd was, well, actually the main question, there may have been others, but we asked him, what can we do? How can we help you, O Minister? And he said, the way ministers always say, give me the evidence. So we said, okay, and the Play Policy Forum out of this meeting discussed, and when he said evidence, he was quite clear. What he means was evidence that will help him unlock interest and funding from other government departments. Remember, the Cabinet Office actually doesn't have a particularly, it's a coordinating group. It doesn't have lots of money for itself, but is actually quite a good department or a good bit of whiteboard to try and get other departments to do things. So it was agreed that CPBF would commission what I called here a quick and dirty literature review. I'll say a bit more about that in a minute, and I was commissioned to do it. And here are all these other reports that I've hinted at earlier. These are all other, you're probably familiar with a lot of them, People Like Play, Getting Right to Play, Play Scotland. This is a government-funded evaluation of Play Pathfinders, A World Without Play, Stuart Lester and Wendy Russell's review. So there's lots. Why do we want to do another one? Answer, because we haven't done anything that will be of that much interest to these people. Apologies for showing you these faces so early on a weekday morning, but what I'm getting at here is that one of the sorry, I've just seen you at the back. There is, if you feel you're a really long way away, there is an empty chair here at the front. But if you're happy at the back, that's fine. One of the ways I think about and understand the policy-making process is that it's a bit like the Dragon's Den, okay? But you're not selling a product, you're not inviting investment in a business, but you are selling ideas. And crucially, you're selling initiatives, interventions. And one of the things that these people, and indeed other politicians at a local level, who have these, by the way, in case you haven't absolutely clocked, these are the politicians who have or would like to have their hands on the purse strings of government. Okay, so Chancellor of the Exchequer, whatever Danny Alexander's post is, which is Chief Treasury Secretary, is it? And then Ed Ball's Shadow Chancellor. So these are the people who really, really want to know what the money is going to be spent on. So these are the people that, if you like, we have in mind, and their local and regional and other equivalents in writing the pay return. Now we'll come back to the question about whether that's the right or the best or the only place to start. But that was my interpretation, if you like, my way of picturing in my head what this report is trying to do. It's trying to sell play initiatives, or to help sell play initiatives to the people who have their hands on the purse strings in public decision making. Oh, and I've got an anecdote. I'd be very surprised if any of you know who this guy is. This is the Honourable Hugh Delahunty. He is the Minister for Sport and Recreation in Victoria, which is a state in Australia, and he happens to be the politician that I've had the most contact with over the last 6 years or so, for reasons that we don't need to go into, and it isn't a whole lot of contact. But anyway, I mean, it's an interesting debate we can have about why it is that Australian politicians seem to be much more interested in children's well-being and play and so on than politicians here, but that's not a conversation for now probably. But so I met him and sort of spoke alongside him a few years back, and then he came to England to do some sort of research and meet people, and I met him at his offices in central London. And I also, this is the point of the anecdote, had a conversation with his spin doctor. Okay, So his special advisor, and those of you who don't know this, is basically the kind of eyes and ears of ministers. They are often the kind of most revealing and potentially influential people to try and make contact with if you're actually interested in what ministers might be interested in. So I can't remember the woman's name now, but we had an interesting conversation, actually it was in public, about evidence and the kind of value and usefulness of evidence, because I was saying that, or pushing the point that actually politicians aren't really interested in evidence. You know, it's an illusion. It's what's sometimes called as policy-based evidence making. Okay, so the idea that you've already decided your policy, and then politicians are interested in evidence only to the degree that it supports policies that they already want to take forward, and that it's all about the gut and the heart, and reinforcing their prejudices and their worldviews and all of that. And she said, well, this is the spin doctor speaking, I don't think that's true. It is true that politicians generally, so you open the door with politicians to a larger or to a greater or lesser extent by offering them ideas that fit with their worldview. So there is that heart, that gut instinct thing. But that door only stays open if you can then back up your idea or your proposal with some evidence. Okay, so if you don't have the evidence, the door shuts again. This is her line, and it's a line that sounds convincing to me. Okay, so here's how we took forward the project. We focused on measurable outcomes, numbers. Okay, some of you, maybe we can talk about that. I'm a numbers person. I actually think numbers are quite helpful, and not just numbers around children, outcomes for children, or what differences make, but also what difference play initiatives, remember we're talking about play initiatives, might make for families or for the wider community. And again, previous reviews have really, I think I'm right in saying, more or less completely ignored that question. And that seems to me to be a missed opportunity and a gap. The project also focused on school-aged children, and that reflects, I'm sure, the interest of most all of you here. But it's important to say, because even if you go back to those other literature reviews, actually a lot of the material in those reviews draws on material from younger children, from preschool aged children. Those findings may or may not be relevant in this case, but because this review is really about trying to say something about the difference that interventions make, we decided it was important that we in reviewing the literature, that we focus on the interventions that we, as a forum, were most interested in. And we didn't want to get sucked into, for instance, the very complex debate around early learning and early child education and the role of play in that. There's huge amounts of material. It would take, both it felt not quite relevant, and also, bearing in mind this is a quick and dirty review, not the best use of the limited resources that we had available. So we focused on the school lecture, and we also decided fairly early on to just focus on 4 types of intervention, and I'll tell you what they are. There they are. You can't read it. Improving play in school break time. So these are interventions that are about typically either kind of putting in equipment, putting in loose parts and stuff, or doing training and other development, and maybe organisational development, or a combination of those 3 in schools during break time. That's the first type of intervention. Second, unstaffed public play facilities, in other words, playgrounds, play areas, and similar facilities. The third type, staffed out-of-school play provision, so the kind of places that typically play workers would work in. And fourthly, street play initiatives. So these are typically short-term regular road closures in residential streets, so that the street can be opened up for children's play. Those were the 4, and again that was a way to kind of narrow down the task have some kind of clear constraints, and also they were, broadly speaking, these kinds of interventions were the kind that we felt were up in the air and open for discussion at the moment anyway. Of those four, by far the majority of the material that we found, I'll go on to say a bit more about how we found the material, but the studies, the reports, the research was around improving play and school break times. If you go anywhere, you may well know this, but looking at for instance, the peer review, the academic journals, lots of papers on different kinds of interventions in schools and what kind of outcomes those interventions lead to. Nothing like the same level of academic research on any of the other three. In terms of non-academic stuff, so evaluation reports and so on, it's a little bit more evenly spread. But overall, if you counted up the evidence that in one way or another fed into this review, the vast majority of it was around school break times. And obviously that's something we need to think about, because actually I suspect most of us here, at the moment anyway, are not doing lots of work in school break times. We're interested in the case that can be made for play interventions in different contexts. So I'll come back to that. Okay. Now I'm going to summarise really briefly the findings, and I don't suppose any of this will be a great Christmas present to any of you. But here we go. I found, take ownership of what, that there is strong evidence that, remember, play initiatives, play interventions lead to increased levels of physical activity. Surprise, surprise. We also found evidence that improving play opportunities is linked to improvements not in narrow academic attainment, so not in kind of SAT results or GCSE results, but in things like readiness to learn and adapting to the school environment. And we found evidence of that play initiatives kind of promote cooperative, collaborative learning, respect between different cultural and ethnic groups, and so on. So there's sort of what you might broadly call sort of social outcomes. And again, the vast majority, particularly of the academic, the scholarly material, is around this first area. There's been a lot of research, thinking back to the diabetes stuff I was mentioning earlier, it's maybe no surprise, on physical activity outcomes. Okay. As I mentioned earlier, we also looked at the difference for families. Here there's much more limited material, but there is some evidence that play initiatives, in particular public playgrounds, increase what we might call sort of family well-being. So families' sense of themselves, and parents' sense of their own families as being, nice families. And then the third area, the difference for communities, there's also evidence of a kind of mix of different outcomes around communities. So there's some evidence of a reduction in crime and antisocial behaviour. It's relatively modest, but this, I'm showing you a report here, it's written some time ago by some people from the Thames Valley Police that presents evidence of reductions in levels of vandalism as a result of installing public play facilities. And likewise, there's some evidence from street play programs of outcomes around bringing communities together and kind of promote and increase levels of community involvement in community action. And some of you may recognise this report from Play England, also evidence of volunteering and quite significant levels of volunteering created through, in this case, staffed play projects, adventure playgrounds and so on. Okay, so that's the picture of the quantitative findings that we found. And I should just say, actually, I'll say a bit in a bit when I come to limitations. I'll say some of the caveats that I want to put on this. but I do just want to share one specific example of a study that we highlighted, not least because I think it again helps to see what are the kind of nuts and bolts, what are the basic building blocks of the kind of claims that are being made in this report. So this is a single study of a playground intervention. So what happened was, in this study, the brief reference is here, but you can find the full reference in the report. 2 primary schools, one is a control school, so you don't do anything, and the other school simply, as I recall, bring in loose materials. Okay, so just a bunch of stuff of the kind that Michael and Kirsty are familiar with, scraps, stuff that might have been reclaimed from a local recycling or scrap centre, I think possibly sports equipment, but no training, nothing else. And then the kids, you measure their levels of physical activity. So that's what you've got here. So here are the 2 schools, the blue school and the red school. Here's the starting point, so what we call baseline. And then they measured yes?
How did they measure it?
I think they had kind of accelerometers. Don't quote me on that, but that's typically the way that you would do it. So you have these, they measure movement.
Yeah.
They're typically strapped on either your arm or your waist. And then they measured the levels of physical activity again at 7 weeks afterwards, and then 8 months afterwards. And you can see this graph shows you that the blue school, so that's what you might call the technical term, the intervention school, physical activity levels increased. In the other school, physical activity levels dropped. And then 8 months, you've still got that difference between the 2 schools. But also just stat geeks might be interested to see here. One nice thing about the study, and this shows you why it's valuable to have a control, if you were just looking at the blue school, okay, if all you did was put in the kit and look at the blue school, and you think, oh dear, 8 months later, physical activity levels have dropped. Damn! But because we've got a control school, you can say, yes, they may have dropped, but they haven't dropped as much as the control school. Maybe it was, maybe this is middle of winter and this was spring, or so. That's a nice, as I put it, robust study. I'm sure that it's not flawless. We could talk a bit more about that, but you can see it's kind of got a level of persuasiveness about it.
Was that UK or?
It was either Australia or New Zealand. And this guy Heinemann is very interested in school play projects. Yes.
Is there anything that links to the specific, the most high-risk children?
No, this would be a population study of a fairly old
Average across the whole.
Exactly, yeah.
Is there any research on that or would encourage those most obese or?
There may be, but I don't know of it. I mean, that's one of the limitations of this piece of research. Really, most of this research was looking at kind of population studies or evaluation reports. And actually, one of the things that we couldn't find, and is mentioned in the report, we couldn't find a lot of material around disabled children or other kind of children who might be kind of subgroups of the overall population. I suspect there is material out there, but we didn't have a chance to find it. Okay. Here's some quotes that I've taken from the report, but these are not quotes from me, these are quotes from some of the reviews and studies. And some of this is in academic terms, they are the findings of literature reviews. So these are researchers that look across different studies and pull those studies together. Not quite what I did, but a bit like what I did, but in a more robust way, in a more kind of methodologically sound way. There you go. Access, solution bits, equipment, playground marking, size of, and access to play space, and the length of the school grade were all associated with changes in grade time level physical activity in intervention studies. So this is a literature review that basically says good evidence that doing stuff in schools to improve play opportunities leads to high levels of physical activity. This is another quote from Antti Pellegrini, who some of you will recognise. This is about those kind of more social outcomes that I talked about earlier. Recess breaks, maximise students' attention to subsequent classwork, and facilitate children's peer relationships as they make the transition into primary school. and Peter Blatchford, your colleague, Phil from Institute of Education. Playground activities can have a positive role in social relations between different ethnic groups, and the paper that I cite there has got the kind of background, quantitative, research on which he bases that claim. Okay, so here's what I concluded. There is strong evidence of what we might call beneficial outcomes. Okay, back to the word I used earlier. Good things happen when you improve play opportunities, or when you carry out these play interventions that I was looking at. The benefits extend beyond children to families and communities. I'll put that little side point there, who wants action. This is a way of smuggling into the report a really important finding that's nothing to do with outcomes, but we wanted to bring it to the attention of ministers. And this is about, if you survey the public about what they care about, what services they care about in their local areas, and Mori, I think, or one of the big polling companies have been doing this for decades. Okay, so you say, what are you most concerned about in your local area? And you give them a range of 25 different things, and it will go from education, health, housing, employment. Then things for children and young people come high up that list. There are two specific types of kind of local facilities. One is around things for young people, or activities, I can't remember the exact phrase, and then another one around facilities for young children or something, but not education facilities. So we just wanted to remind anyone reading this report that not only is there this, we think, reasonably strong evidence about the kind of outcomes that politicians are interested in, but your voters, over politicians, also care about this stuff. We also argued, and I'll say how we argued this, that these different benefits, quite disparate benefits as you can see, need to be thought of as a whole. So that it will be a mistake in terms of framing or setting up a play intervention to just get hung up on physical activity, because if you do that, you risk losing some of those other outcomes. And there is some. That's not just an assertion from me or a desperate attempt to try and fend off, I don't know, hamster cages and the like. There's academic studies that back up that claim. And lastly, in a way, this is the Christmas present. Improving opportunities for play is a valid outcome in itself. Okay, so given, we argue in this report, I argue in this, given this pretty robust, consistent evidence about all sorts of wider outcomes that reliably emerge from play interventions, we don't always need, funders don't need to keep on demanding evidence and measurement, evaluation of those wider outcomes. It's just enough to measure whether more kids are playing. And that's the approach that I've just taken in this report, which I thought I'd better just give a quick plug to, which is an evaluation of a street play programme, a council-wide street play programme in Hackney, that was actually the main measure of that was kids playing out in the street. But it it drew some wider conclusions on the back of that. Okay. So those are the conclusions, and the other thing that we talk about in the report, and again this isn't strictly speaking part of this evidence gathering. It's trying to pull out again for our audience, for our target audience, those people who are there in the Dragon's Den, what, in lay terms, in fairly simple terms, what are the kind of ingredients that seem to run across these different types of play interventions that we looked at. And we're quoting from Stuart and Wendy's, I can't remember that I think might be the report they did for you.
Beautiful.
Yeah. Outdoor Playing Learning report. The reference is in the report here. But you can actually pull out kind of four broad ingredients, if you like, of the kind of play offer that matches up. Yeah, I think so. I'll take your word for it. It's available from the Playing website. I think there's references to all of this stuff in the report, which is itself downloadable from various places, I'll say. where. But the time is mostly kind of obvious, really. Time, so an amount of time for children to play, a space that facilitates, that offers play opportunities. Other children, surprising how a lot of adults forget about that. But of course children are all too aware. And there's a lovely quote, just might be a quote from a playground design guide, which, and I can't remember the author now, I might remember the name in a minute. And it's actually not a particularly good guide. But there's one quote in it which I think is beautiful, which says, the most important loose material in the playground is our children. And I think that's, everything I see about when playgrounds really, or play spaces, come alive, confirms, I think, that. And then finally, the fourth ingredient, supportive attitude. Now, that may just be almost through the absence of adults, messing up and stepping in too much, or it might be a more active engagement from adults in the form of play work or other lunchtime supervisors and so on. And that those key ingredients can be found both in schools and beyond. And the point that we're making there is that, okay, it is the case that most of the claims that we make in this report are based on findings from school interventions. But you can generalise. It's reasonable, I'm arguing, it's reasonable to generalise those findings because you also find these ingredients, not just in school playgrounds, but in other places that we're interested in. So in public play areas, in event playgrounds, in street projects and so on. Now there's probably more you can say about that, but you can see the rationale behind kind of taking decision makers on a route, on a stepping stone from what is undeniable, which is most of the evidence based on schools, to saying yes, but it's also relevant to these other contexts. It's obvious, it's all obvious. This is just, why do we need to know? Jan Cosgrove, lesson, some of you will know Jan, Fair Play for Children's long time Supremo, commented on my blog in typically robust fashion. Why do we have to churn this stuff out? Politicians have known this for years. We just need to man the barricades and storm the decision makers and the rightness of our blah blah blah. I'm paraphrasing, but I don't think it is obvious. Yes, it's obvious to us, of course it is. But I'm going to give you an example that tries again to kind of put you in a position of somebody who is a bit sceptical, or somebody who might take a different view. And I'm going to do so by looking at a completely different kind of intervention. Okay, this is not to do with play at all. I'm going to talk about this. A program called Scared Straight, and you can see it's a program that was so well acclaimed that an Academy Award-winning documentary about Scared Straight was produced about 30 or 40 years ago. And the idea behind Scared Straight, the name gives it away. This is stopping young people, typically men, young men, from becoming criminals by taking them into prisons and showing them the reality of prison life and of what being a criminal and being incarcerated means. Okay, so that's the basic idea of the program. People who are at risk of offending, shown the reality of life in prison. I'm about to share with you the findings of a literature review about the outcomes, the effectiveness of Scared Straight. Okay. So here's a quote from the paper. I just want anyone who can read that bullet point, tell me in simple terms, what does that quote say?
Don't do it.
It certainly says don't do it. Sorry?
It's worse than useless.
It's worse than useless. Thank you very much. It actually makes those who participate more likely to offend than doing nothing. Okay? Not great for intervention. Now the reason I'm trying to really nail down why I'm showing this. Now I'm guessing I'm making a sweeping generalisation here that most of the people in this room would not be that sympathetic to the scared straight approach. Okay, doesn't particularly sit well with people interested in play. That's kind of irrelevant. There are lots of people who are very committed and believe in and I'm sure would passionately argue for scared straight, and I'm sure those people would have lots of anecdotes about just what a difference it made to Darren, who went to the prison and saw the and so on and so forth. What this highlights is two things. Firstly, believing something's effective doesn't make it so, and looking at what the evidence tells us is useful. There may still be politicians who are persuaded of the benefits of scared straight, but I would hope and expect that the number of politicians who are interested in this programme is less than it would otherwise be, because there is this pretty unarguable evidence that it's worse than useless. So now what I've done in this report is nothing like as robust as what these guys did. But I'm just going to just pull out a little bit more about what I think these are actually kind of reasonable approaches to thinking about what difference interventions make, and when we look at the evidence, what we need to think about. Biases are everywhere. Okay, we all have our biases, and one of the, I think, valuable things about my report is that it actually gets away from the kind of, well, you would say that, wouldn't you? You know, Play England would say da-da-da. And I'm almost nothing in my report. It's not quite true, but a fair amount of what's claimed in my report isn't me or the Children Play Policy Forum speaking. It's people who have a rather less close interest, and the Chief Medical Officer is in there somewhere. And that's really, if you haven't looked at the Chief Medical Officer's 2013 annual report and what it says about play, then you really should. Standard moral for quantitative researchers: evidence is not the plural of anecdote. You don't get good evidence by gathering up a whole bunch of anecdotes. It doesn't mean to say anecdotes are useless, and it doesn't even mean that sometimes, if you do it properly, you can get some quite useful quantitative, some reasonably hard evidence from anecdotes. But anecdotes are, generally speaking, subject to all sorts of problems, the most obvious of which is just sample size of 1, sample size of 3. You want a bit more evidence that whatever you're claiming is going to happen a bit more often than for 1 or 2 people. So be careful picking those cherries. And the third point, which I don't go into all of this in very much detail in the report, but this point, you might find that doing something has a good outcome, has a positive outcome. Let's say hypothetically, school playground interventions do lead children to be more physically active. But actually, when you look at how much more physically active they are, it turns out not very much. That is not the case in real life, just to clarify that. But you can see how, as a politician, you're not just interested in does something make a difference, but how much difference does it make, and in particular, is it going to make as much difference as these other things that might also be relevant to this area of public policy. Okay, so I've hinted at some of this stuff already, but these are the I think, quite reasonable criticisms of this whole enterprise. It is not a systematic review. Okay, I did not. When I say systematic review, there's a fairly, indeed very tightly framed academic process when you do a proper systematic review that I won't bore you with, but it involves an awful lot of desk work and crunching bibliographic databases and stats, geekery, and that's not what we were intending here. But this process did incorporate some of, 1 or 2 of the kind of process. So for instance, one of the things that I was interested in that we tried to capture in this review was other systematic reviews. Okay, so where there were other people who carried out these really hard-nosed academic studies in relevant areas, those were highlighted, those were given quite a lot of prominence in the report. The second limitation is you could argue that and I think it's a reasonable argument, that the kind of picture that this report paints is, it doesn't do full justice to the wider impact of play initiatives. For instance, I suspect that there is material from early years, from looking at younger children, that would actually that maybe would look at, for instance, children's emotional development, ideas around kind of resilience, and what psychologists call self-efficacy, this sort of sense of, me being somebody who has an impact, who can have some say over and influence over the people and places around me. That sort of stuff, I suspect there might be some material out there that we didn't find. But the big, I suspect that I may be wrong about this, but the criticism that would be most kind of pertinent to many of you in this room is the one that I hinted at from the very first, that voting, that poll. Is this really a good place to start? I've said the right perspective, maybe is it a good perspective? And there are various ways of unpacking this criticism, but one of them, I suppose, is this one. There you go. Not everything that counts can be counted, and not everything that can be counted counts. So this idea that are we really? I think there's a couple of things going on here. One is, are we measuring the right things? But also, does the very act of measuring, does the very act of seeing children, in this case, let's focus on children, of trying to measure what happens to them as missing out on, or seeing them in an inappropriate way. And I guess one way of saying it is that surely we should be interested in children's rights and entitlements rather than, and in particular children's right to play, and not just that something may or may not, leave them slightly more healthy in 20 or 40 years' time. I'm going to suggest that we park that criticism, because I think I'd be surprised if it didn't come out in Q&A. So that we'll come back to that. All I will say is that Einstein never said that, and this is a rather obsessive scholarly point, that one of the things that I tried to do with this was kind of give some good references and make this review transparent and check my sources. And if you check your sources, this quote, Einstein never said it. So there's a general rule that if you hear somebody or see something on Facebook or Twitter attributed to Einstein, he probably didn't say it. So if you remember nothing else from this session, then take that away. That thing about bees, he never said it. Okay, so where are we now? Yes, Nick Head is no longer the Minister for whatever he was in the Cabinet Office, so that door shut. However, the report has been presented to officials, and there does seem to be some interest, particularly from the Department of Health, and that fits, I think, with that second bullet point I've got here. There are big changes, I'm sure many of you know, there's big changes happening in public health. Local authorities taking over the budgets of public health from the old, where we used to have it, health authorities, I suppose. And so that's a real opportunity. There are people who have budgets now, who are making decisions about priorities, and whose job is to improve the public health, the level of health of their areas. And already we know that play interventions are being supported through these bodies. The Hackney programme that I just mentioned a few minutes ago, that is being funded through a Health and Wellbeing Board. Anyone else got any examples of funding? I think Brighton, I'm right in saying that.
NHS are funding playgrounds to be built to increase levels of activity.
Right.
In Camden.
In Camden, okay. Right, okay. So, will that be the Camden's Health and Wellbeing Board? I think it probably would be. Okay, any other examples?
Baines, they're funding training in Baltimore, they're funding training in schools, lunchtime staff, and play ranges. I think they're still funding. Certainly they were funding play ranges.
Yeah. And
in Sheffield, there's a fund relating on the decision we just announced it the other week. The
Okay. So this is, that's real evidence of an interest, and public health people tend to be pretty evidence focused. It's certainly been my experience that they really want to see, they want to be able to walk through that sort of chain of cause and effects that I took you through earlier. Yes, they've got an election coming up, and there is some work going on to try and influence manifestos and party political positions, but obviously the clock is ticking there. And then after the new election, we'll have a new bunch of people who I would hope might have some interest in the contents of this report. I've just got one final anecdote. Of course, it's an anecdote, it's not a quantitative study, but and it is Brighton and Hove. Now, I don't want to overdress this, but I've kind of checked this with Paul Waller, who's somebody who knows, head of the play service at Brighton and Hove. He happened to ask me down to present on the play return last November, and as it turned out, I don't think he knew this at the time we set it up, but by the time I came up, if I'm not mistaken, the very afternoon or a day or two later, after the seminar that he got me to speak at, the proposal was up for the play service to be completely axed. And at one point it looked like that was the decision that was made. But as you'll see from the bullet point, the play service has had a partial reprieve after this seminar. Now, I don't want to kind of claim that I was, the heroic, trusty steed, and fending off the bubble up. It's obviously there are no doubt all sorts of things going there. But I spoke to Paul yesterday, and he said yes, it's reasonable to say that the report and that seminar did have an influence. It did help in. And by the way, politics in Brighton and Hove is, I gather, in a state of chaos at the moment. So I can't even claim that play service is going to survive, because the council is loggerheads and hasn't even been able to set a budget. So who knows? That's probably a lesson in the contingencies of making the case. But at least for possibly things are a bit better than they might otherwise have been, and the fact that Paul and his colleagues had this material to play into those conversations appears to have fended off the worst outcome in terms of his play service. Okay, so I think here we go. I'm nearly finished, so I'm going to do the vote again. And I'm sure you're all very independent-minded people, not going to necessarily. You'll make a considered judgment. So I'm going to ask you the same question: gateway or trap? Show of hands. Gateway. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15, 16, 17, 18.
Somebody left.
Somebody left. Thank you, Sarah. Okay, trap. Hand up. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9.
I would say both for me. No, it is both gateway and trap.
Yeah.
Well, I'm sure that'll come out in the Q&A, in the discussion. Okay, well, make of that what you will. Of course, if we had a statistician in the room, they could tell us whether or not that change was statistically significant.
Where's the control group as well?
I'm not going to go there. But my hunch is this. I've used the phrase many mansions because somebody used that from me a while ago. I don't think there's any one way that's either guaranteed or even necessary to make your case and get political and public policy change. In fact, I think it's good if you have passionate pleas to the heart and just pointing out how much good play opportunities matter to children, how what their kind of minute by minute experience and engagement in good play opportunities says and tells us. So I think it's good to have that kind of rights-based, entitlement-based arguments, but it's also good to have evidence, to be able to point to what is in fact I think quite a helpful body of evidence that says, yes, that's not only, what's going on here is not only what's happening for the children here and now, but also reasonably consistent and robust changes in not just their lives, but the lives of their families and communities. I really do think it's good to have a debate about that. But I've made one more point, and that's, it may seem like I'm kind of just, I'm just kind of playing a game here, a bit like these politicians were playing a game when they were swinging on the swing in the launch of the play review. I'm not just saying, we have to suck it up, really. The politicians they go and want some numbers, even if it's just to keep the bean counters happy. I actually think it's not unreasonable in a democracy to be concerned about whether the money that our politicians spend on our behalf actually makes the difference that they say it is going to make. I think that's not an unreasonable request. Amongst other things, as well as looking at whether the things that governments do, reflect values and principles and rights and entitlements that I subscribe to, I don't think it's unreasonable to also be interested in, but what in the real world, with real people, what actually, how is the world going to be different as a result of spending this money or doing these things? So I think that's fair enough. Discuss. There you go. That's where you can find the reports, a couple of blog posts, and I'm fairly sure you can download it direct from there. If not, you can download it from several websites: Play England, Play Scotland, Play Wales. Let's hear your thoughts. I know some of the people in here, I don't know others, so if you could introduce yourself as well, and everyone, not just you.
Hello everybody, I'm Michael Follett. I worked for 12 years as a play strategy person for local councils, and I'm now
Adrian, sorry, there's a seat right down here.
I run a not-for-profit organisation called Opal Outdoor Play and Learning, especially promoting a strategic approach to planning play in primary schools. And apart from measuring the physical activity, which I can see how you can get hard numbers for, I'm faced with the problem, as many of us are, I think, is what numerical data is it feasible to collect and economically viable to collect, because gathering evidence about play, especially actually numerical data that stands up to academic testing, is hideously expensive. So what are the numbers could we collect that would be useful as a gateway?
Good question. One of the not really answers to that question, but slight parallel things that I hope this report will give play people the tools to do is to say, well, we don't have to collect some of this data because academics have done it for us. They've done the legwork, so we don't have to. And so certainly some of the studies have used quite sophisticated psychological measurements of children's attitudes, or have done kind of teacher surveys or parental surveys. But because they, to the degree that they've been looking at what we're talking about, they've done that work, so we don't have to. That's one answer. I'll just finish, and then I'll come over to you in a minute. I think the other thing to say is that there are probably numerical things that haven't been looked at properly that could still add to this picture. And one of them actually the school playgrounds. I'm desperate to see, and it really wouldn't be very difficult to get numbers on playground accidents, numbers on teacher interventions, basically kind of ground, whatever you want to call it, kind of punishments and suspensions, or even visits to the head teacher. And I visited a school that has play pods. So Mrs. Kirsty's scrap store play pods, where the head teacher had no doubt that the level of injuries and the level of incidents plummeted after they brought the play pods into the school. But she couldn't give the numbers. But she had the numbers. All it would need would probably be 6 hours' work for somebody to go through a couple of accident books and report books, and maybe twin up with another school down the road that hadn't had play pods. Then you've got that nice comparison, and so it wouldn't be that difficult. Now that's a different measure to the measures I've been talking about here, but it's not very. For instance, if you've got kids going in to the injury room, well, they're not out playing. Okay, they're probably sitting on a chair for half an hour. So that's, you see what I mean? That's a kind of, it's the absence of being able to play is itself a negative outcome. So if you can show that there are a few kids sitting on their asses outside the nurse's office, then that in itself is a nice
We've
positive
got
outcome.
quite a lot of that, we just don't quite know how to...
You need someone to help you split it and pull it all together and present it.
I mean, we get teachers regularly email us and say, I've had 87% less visits to me after playtime this term. And you go, great.
And it's good stuff. I mean, I think Stuart and Wendy might have been in that report, had really striking quantitative. 10 head teachers were asked what their thoughts were on your programme. 8 of them said it was the best thing since sliced bread. That's a number. Okay, it's a sample size of 10. Any scholar will know that that's relatively limited, but you presented the numbers and they can make their judgment. I think there are. I guess one of the things that I don't say this in the report, but one of the implicit messages of this is play people have been so nervous for so long about outcomes and numbers that we've let loads of other people do the stuff for us, and we haven't taken this line of thinking and been proactive about it and said, okay, we think these are numbers that you should be interested in. And I think there's a way of doing that. Now, there's just, yes, and can you introduce yourself as well?
It's nice. I work at a primary school and I'm holiday placing instructors in the veg playground. And I play coordinator for our school. I can only say what I'm doing on an individual level for our school, which is kind of following what Michael was saying and kind of proving, data from the school. So I'm in the process of kind of looking through all the accident books and analysing all the accidents that have happened and if they are to do with relative to play or whatever. But also from a behaviour point of view for our head, she has our part of the behaviour system is a kind of yellow and red card.
Okay, yeah.
And she is giving me the data before we brought in all our sort of play strategies and the work that we've been doing. I'm going to look at this stuff beforehand and then see, how it's affected and effect afterwards. So there will be a count of yellow and red cards.
And dare I ask if you're going to try and pull this together into a report? Something
definitely.
I mean, it's amazing how valuable it is to just have a document. It doesn't need to be published by anybody else. It's just something that somebody can hold on to and look at. And yes, of course, it's nice if it's got somebody with some letters after their name, but it doesn't have to. And I really encourage anyone in the room who has simply got some numbers to consider trying to pull them together. Now, just Tom, I think there's someone else you want to come in as well. Yes.
Yes, that's...
and can you introduce yourself?
I'm Gemma Hughes. I'm co-director of Mason Scratch Limited. We build playgrounds in schools.
Okay. I'm just going to get some water, but carry on talking.
Yeah, my question is looking at all the different kinds of research. And you're talking about robust research, and I assume that there's not so robust research. How do you go about, perhaps, small providers or people that are making services, individuals go about assessing their own outcomes, what they're delivering in a robust way? So that one way is to have that twinning up of something that's not doing what you're doing. Something we think about often is how can we prove that what we're doing is of worth or value, and what makes people, what makes people take notice.
Sure.
What do you find?
Michael's got some thoughts on that, and I will come back to you, Tom, as well in a minute. Yeah.
One of the bits of data that I've been trying to gather with mine is before I start doing a baseline of getting them to count the number of hours of people's time during a week that is a kind of not positive interventions around play. So how many, the lunchtime supervisors, maybe 10 minutes a day dealing with problems and fights, the head teacher, the deputy, and then putting a cost to that, so basing it on people's salaries, their hourly rate. So what is the cost of negative outcomes of playtime, and then at the end of the project, how much has that dropped and how much money? So it's very mercenary, but it says how much money has this.
I mean, that's if I'm a politician, I think this is gold dust. I've got head teachers coming to me saying I was spending an hour a day hoovering up the kind of bad outcomes of rubbish playgrounds. I mean rubbish, in the play sense. And now I've done this thing, I'm spending 2 minutes. That's an hour a day of my time that I can be doing the other stuff that the government wants me to do.
That's whatever they cost,
yeah.
£100 an hour.
Full costs, including, pensions, their share of the building running costs, LEA administration, blah, blah, blah. That's a significant sum, yeah. Now, I think that's exactly, and simple activities for that. So that report that I flashed up earlier, here we go, this street play evaluation, basically what that report, the main thing that report did, well, various things. One was just count up the number of hours, the number of child hours that were being spent out in the street. And it turned out to be 8,000 child hours over the course of the year. And I just crunched the numbers and said, that's equivalent to 14 extra PE classes running through a school year. Okay, that's the sort of thing a politician can picture, can make sense of. We also counted up the number of cars that were diverted during the course of a session. That's a different number, and the value of that number is that one of the things that people are worried about with play streets or street initiatives is, it's going to cause traffic chaos. It's so inconvenient and can't. Why? Streets for cars, they're not for anyone. So it turns out that typically in Hackney, dense part of East London, on average over a 2 to 3 hour session, 9 cars, have to drive a bit slowly or get diverted to do another route. Now I think even the most dedicated petrol head would say that isn't a particularly massive imposition. So that's another example of a number that is helpful. It doesn't speak to outcomes, but it is useful. Yes. Sorry, hang on. Tom's first.
Yeah, Tom Williams, like Michael, I was a play officer for Bristol for 12 years. I'm now doing other stuff, which you can see tomorrow if you come to my session. That was my plug. I don't want to waste time telling you. I think there's an elephant in the room, which is motivation within the sector. And I speak as a manager of play workers who try to get play workers to collect this stuff. I speak as the husband of a teacher who spends 20 hours a week teaching and 40 hours max trying to evidence the impact of that 20 hours, which is not good for her health or whatever. And the youth service, who, I was a senior manager in the youth and play service in Bristol, and the youth service very much tied themselves to this evidencing outcomes approach. I'm not sure that they're in a better position for going down that route.
Yeah.
I visited adventure playgrounds in Copenhagen and Berlin and talked to all of the play workers there about whether they have to collect this kind of outcome stuff, and they're like, no, we don't do that, we don't need to think about that.
I'll come back to Copenhagen in a minute.
Yeah. So I've always been convinced that some kind of outcome evidence is really important, but it needs to be the right outcome evidence. And if play can find that golden egg and present it, then we'll be in a much better position. But if we're going to do it, let's do it right and not make the mistakes that other agencies have made.
I think that's a really, really powerful point, and I can't find much to disagree with. And I guess. So it's there's a warning sign. I think that's what you're saying. That look what's happened to teaching. It's now become arguably a profession that's beset by high stakes testing and performance management and the tail wagging the dog and so on and so forth. That seems to me to be a salutary tale, but it need not. I mean, even if you accept that, it need not. And I don't know the youth service well enough to know whether a similar story can be told there. But I don't think it necessarily is the. I think there are reasons why you could say it won't happen that way with play. I mean, firstly, there's a very obvious fact about play that is utterly beyond dispute, which is it is about children choosing and about that essential quality of children having control over what they're doing in an ongoing basis. So not just choosing in the sense of picking one of 3 different activities, but actually, they can playing freely means this is boring, I'm going to stop and do something else. And I think that so in a way it's bringing together the kind of some sort of thing about outcomes with some thinking about entitlements and process that. It really isn't hard to spot when kids are stopping doing something that's freely chosen play and starting doing something. Whereas with the youth service, I don't think it's not quite the same. There's that idea of social education, as I understand it, was in the youth service for a long time, and that maybe that was right, maybe it was wrong, but it's different.
Can I respond to that?
Okay, yes, do, yeah.
I'm Phil from the Institute of Education, and I'm not a play worker, but I'm a researcher around children's rights and music, arts and play. I'm going to talk after this, and I talk about the play return in my talk.
Oh,
but just and it's a lovely report, and it's I think there's an importance in armouring up with kinds of evidence. But to build on what you're saying, I wonder if you found any research that had looked at what children thought mattered about play and turned that into criteria for looking at evidence-based.
Yeah.
Because I guess one of the, I don't think I agree with what you just said.
Okay.
Because I think there are very powerful forces at work in this country which are different from other countries, and we're often taught to think there's no alternative to this particular looking at outcomes. And we wouldn't stand, I think, in contemporary society for services for black people devised by white people, or services devised for women by men, although 60 years ago that was the case. And yet, because of the minority position which children are given, which is that views are not valued, my experience of reading your report is that you didn't find any evidence that looked at children's agendas and how that could be prioritised, rather than adult preoccupations with health or goods from play.
Yeah. It's not true that we didn't find it. It is true that we didn't look for it. It wasn't part of the brief of the project. And you're absolutely right that was a strategic decision, if you like. I mean, it may not have been framed in those stark terms. In other words, I don't remember us having a debate within the Play Policy Forum, what might we look at, shall we look at children's views and try and capture those.
Or research that has gone into that.
Indeed.
That as a framework for everything.
Yeah. And I think that would be a crucial piece of work. But it's not the brief of the project in which I've gone. I mean, the only thing I will also say, this is a huge, the beginning of a huge conversation that we've got nowhere near time for, but actually I don't think that analogy between the position of black people and white people and women and men is as true for children. I don't believe that children are a minority oppressed group in the same sense that other adults are. In other words, I think there is something about the life course and the change that the journey that children go through as they grow up that is different than. But it's a huge conversation, and we could then spend the rest of the session talking about social constructivism and the sociology of childhood. All I'm saying is, I think it's not. I don't consider that by thinking, and I'm partly kind of reflecting on my role as a parent, because I often kind of wait. In having an interest in what might help my daughter grow up and have better choices and health in life, I don't think I'm being oppressive. I'm also interested in whether she's happy and healthy and having a nice time in the here and now. And actually, as a parent, I find myself doing both those things. And in a way, now you can say that's incredibly naive in the context of this report, because actually all politicians are interested in is the outcomes. I actually don't think that's the case, but I do think, and just come back to Copenhagen and Denmark. When I went to Denmark a few years ago and talked about what was going on in the adventure playgrounds, I got a lot of anxiety from play workers about what was happening in the wider public policy debate in Denmark, and one of the problems there is that Denmark doesn't do very well on the international comparisons in education. So yes, at the moment, play workers aren't, as I understand it, doing very much around saying what difference does our service make for kids. But what they are finding is that they're at the very sharp end of some political decisions about where overall money is being spent in children's services. And my argument would be, it's not enough to just revert back to children's rights, and if they can't say something about why spending time in a well-resourced, well-staffed construction playground is better than sitting at home or being in a homework club, then they've got problems. Yes?
I just want to pick up on what you're saying. My name's Amy Washington, and I'm here as chair of Pittsburgh Adventure Playground in Sheffield. I also, my day job is something else in Sheffield, I would say, but the point you were making about, measuring what children's outcomes are around saying that they feel important, I think we've done that in the past, but people haven't listened because they're wanting these other outputs. They're the ones that are asking us what evidence is there around the improvement to health, what evidence is there around the improvement to road safety, things like that. So we kind of, on a practical level, we feel forced to go down that route and to gather that evidence together. I'd be really happy to do what you've suggested, but I do think that other people need to be actually taking that on board, not just
Well, that's a challenge, okay? And it's exactly, I remember having a conversation with Malcolm King, who some of you will know who was and possibly still is the chair of the Big Adventure Playground in Wrexham, 15 years ago when I was not on in the Children's Play Council, about how we engage in that. He's also, by the way, or was, a senior politician, who's a local councillor. And I mean, this is his view, other people will take a different view, but in his view, one of the problems that play advocates at the time, that he felt about play advocates at the time, is that they, in his words, they kept on wanting, they sat at the side of the pitch wanting to change the rules. Okay? And there's only so long you can do that before you either you take up your kit bag and you go home, or you join the game. Okay? It's a dilemma probably all of us face. But it's actually very hard to change the rules. I've tried changing the rules. I think we've had some success in changing the rules in some areas of, for instance, around risk in play. We've changed the rules, but it's hard. That piece of work around risk benefit, which I talked about this one last year, probably overall took about 15 years. We sort of had a go with outcomes when those of us, again, some of us in the room, around best play. That was 1999 it was published, and it didn't fly. Still a few little kind of glimmers of interest in that piece of work. I have to think that was a reasonably well argued and thought through piece of work, but it didn't fly for reasons that we could go into. I'll leave it there, but Adrian, I know you want to come in, and then yes, Joe, and then I think we might, we'll see how it goes, but Adrian.
It flew a little bit. It became, albeit in an adopted and adapted format, it became part of the rationale for the Big Lottery Fund. The outcomes that they were looking for their programme, their big children's play programme, not just the innovative one, were derived from Best Play, and the Big Lottery programme paved the way for the National Play Policy. So it did fly a little bit. And we tend to, so it feels sometimes as though we forget that we actually made some quite significant progress by sticking to our guns and trying to develop a rationale that was based on what we understand about play from a play work perspective, not purely a developmental psychology perspective. And part of that was a rights-based framework. The Charter for Children's Play takes its starting premise as Article 31 of the UN Convention on the Rights of the Child. And I think it's I mean, you may have already said all this, Tim, and I'm sorry that I missed your actual thought. But I think it's a little bit of a false dichotomy to think we have to make a choice between whether we make the argument for play provision on a rights-based premise or on an outcomes evidence-based approach. I think it is a completely false dichotomy, and ultimately, politicians don't make decisions, in my experience, and just in my general observation of the way things work. They don't make the decisions on either of those things. They make their decisions based on what's going to win them the most votes. And we need to be smart about that. So we need a rationale. You have to have a rationale. You have to have a persuasive argument, and part of that is having some evidence to justify what you're saying, so that people know that you're serious. And you need to know that you're serious, and you have integrity about what you're arguing. But you will not win the policy game purely on evidence. You need a persuasive hearts and minds argument as well. And the children's rights framework is a very strong one. It's a universal one, and it's part of the legal framework. We forget that. We talk about it as though it's just a platitude. It's part of the legal framework. It's an international treaty that governments have signed up to, and it's a long-term commitment from government to government, because the UN Convention doesn't get reviewed very often. And we now have a general comment that explicates exactly what Article 31 means, which sets out a very powerful case for a broad-ranging, multi-tiered approach to what states and states parties at all levels, including local governments, should be doing for children's play. And I think we need to use that, as well as we need to look for the evidence of what different types of play provision can actually do for children and their families. Of course, we need that as well.
I don't think I disagree, and it may have been just before you came in, but it was that was the many mansions point. And I think it's also interesting, I mean, having looked at the general comment in some detail, a fair amount of the argument in that general comment is actually based on outcomes-based thinking. So I think it is a false dichotomy. Now there was Leslie, and then Chris, were you? Okay, we've got 2 minutes, so Leslie, if you think
Skills activity research asking children what they wanted from state provision and play workers. It was quite a few years ago now, but it wasn't an enormous sample. One of the problems, though, in getting that read by politicians is that children don't have a vote, and to a certain extent they can rights. That if we don't have the evidence base, they're not going to listen. And because children don't have a vote, they don't get a vote. And politicians really aren't that interested, even though part of the community.
I've just got the lyrics to Summertime Blues playing in my head as you say that. Yes, I think it's a very good point. Sarah Jane, you wanting to?
Just very quickly to say that if anyone wants to read the evaluation report, it's in the bar area on a table with some miniature dustbins on it. So it's there, and you can have it to take home if you want it.
Thank you very much. And yes, I'm sure there is. I have a hunch that some of the work that you've been talking about, Phil, might have been done around a kind of proper, thoughtful exploration of what children have been telling adults, not just by their words, of course, but by their deeds. Because one of the things I think play workers know is that actually asking children about their play is not always the best way to understand what good play opportunities look like. But I'm sure there is material out there, but I'm sure it could also be more could be done with it than has been done with it. Okay, it is 11:30. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Well, that's sort of the answer to Michael's question. I think yeah, so one of the things that schools have got sucked into is these demands of accountability. And I don't know, in a parallel universe where they said, you know, there's a lot of research that we can do. So actually we don't need to be good at it. But I thought it didn't maybe
it's very specific
and reach, you know, how many people in your area don't think
what it achieves and how it's a story to really a little bit
one of the worries there is, I know I came across about the week, he's a professional counsel, so he's actually but he states and he's strapped on both barometers and GPS. So he can't use our but where they work over a 4-day period, 2 days a week and 2 days were there 3 months ago. And so they're publish a number of
not so much in discussion.
I mean, I haven't quite present, so
I mean, Zoe might be able to do it. I don't want to hear it exactly trying to bring everything. You know what I mean?
Have you tried to reward it?
Yeah. I can send her a message and just say, if you get this before lunchtime, I think Kathy maybe is
brilliant.
The only real option is
there's two options. There's like text Zoe and just say, I try to call you, or let me know ASAP if you can do it. I'll give her a deadline of time. Or I just say now, just be playing the stress and say it won't.
They're unusual, as you probably know. They're architects, so they can use for a long
So I'll need to do this bit here about